It is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage David Curran, who is the co-chair of the Sustainability and ESG Advisory Practice at Paul Weiss. And David will be joined virtually by SEC Commissioner Jaime Lizárraga.
Commissioner, just give us a minute. We couldn't hear you.
Okay.
Oh,
Can you hear now?
Oh, yeah. Loud and clear. And thank you, everyone. I've been sitting in and watching the programs this morning. It's really, and thank you to our friends at UC Berkeley Law for putting together such a terrific governance program. And Commissioner, thank you. Not that there's anything going on in Washington today. I think there was a thing called Election Day yesterday, something like that. So I'm sure that's not of any interest to you. But I may be to the folks here who've assembled, and it's a great crowd. Wish you could be here, but understand that you've got busy things to do in our nation's capital. We're gonna have some questions that the commissioner has agreed to walk through. But first of all, I just would like to see a show of hands. How many people here are lawyers? And it's okay to admit it. Good. So a majority of the people in the room, Commissioner, are lawyers. One of the unenviable tasks that I have is I'm going to try and capture the collision of ESG and law, in particular securities law, in 30 minutes. So pretty good, pretty easy. One of the things that I'm going to have to do is summarize a 500-plus page proposed rulemaking issued by the SEC some months ago, which received a fair amount of comment. Wouldn't that be fair to say, Commissioner? I think over 14,000 responses. So I'm going to do that for just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to get right into the discussion. But before we do that, Commissioner, your personal journey to the SEC is quite interesting. I'm sure the audience would just love to hear a little bit how you got there. I know I'm always curious as to how people get into senior roles within the government. So if you could do that, and then I'll go into some of the nitty-gritty on the rulemaking.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, David. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you to the organizers of UC Berkeley. I'm an alum from the UC system from UC San Diego, so it's an honor to speak to you today. My journey here took about close to 32 years. And that's the period in which I've been a public servant in my entire career. After I graduated from UC San Diego, I went to graduate school at the University of Texas, at the LJ School of Public Affairs, got my master's. I came to Washington, started out as an auditor of government programs at the congressional agency known as it was then known as the General Accounting Office, now known as the Government Accountability Office. And I decided a couple of years later that I wanted to do something more hands-on. So a position on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, and I never left, except for a couple of years where I went to the Treasury Department in the Clinton administration, and as a political appointee there, as well as here at the SEC. I was here at the SEC as a staff person in the late 90s. And then I went back to the Hill, to the Committee on Financial Services, which, as you may know, legislates on all matters related to financial services policy in the United States, and including the SEC. And a few years later, when the historic election of 2006, Speaker Pelosi ascended to that position, and she brought me over to her office. I worked with her, asked her senior advisor on these matters for 15 years. And then I was approached about this opportunity, which it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So I couldn't pass it up. And after going through Senate confirmation and being confirmed unanimously by the Senate, I was sworn in on July 18th, and I'm thrilled to be here to work on these very important issues for the American public, for investing public, for working families.
Thank you. That's a fascinating journey, and obviously, having been in all those different roles, you have unique insights, some of which I know you're going to share with the audience today. Let me run through a little bit just my encapsulation of the rulemaking, just so everybody has the sort of same standard framework for those who are not all that familiar with it, and then we'll get right to some of the questions. So there's, as I said, there are 500 pages of details, but essentially registrants would be required to present in their annual reports or registration statements information along the following: company board and management oversight and sort of governance of climate-related risks, the material impact that these risks had or are likely to have on the business and the financial statements of companies, how they affect or are likely to affect strategy and the business model of a company in their outlook, climate-related pressures and processes, metrics, and this is very important, and I think a lot of lawyers who don't practice securities law are not following as much, at least based on my intel from the space, the financial implications of climate-related information that companies are sharing with the public. How does this play out in terms of financial performance for the companies over time? We'll come back to that. And then one of the most certainly controversial elements of the rulemaking that has invited lots of comments is detailed disclosures on greenhouse gas emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3, which we won't go into detail here, but in particular, scope 3 has been the focus of lots of discussion in the media and the like. The comment period for this was recently extended due to a glitch, I think it was described in the submission process, where a couple of hundred out of these 14,000 plus comments were not captured, and so the comment period was reopened. So the rules are not yet final. When I see the media, a lot of them act as if it is, and that they're waiting for the Supreme Court to immediately rule and overturn them, even though they're not rules yet. So this is an opportunity now with the commissioner, before these have become final, to get his insights. So I think it's a really, really interesting time. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question for you, Commissioner. So you weren't at the SEC when these rules were promulgated, but you've said publicly that you would have voted in favor of them. Could you share with the audience why that is, why you would have voted in favor of them, and sort of the reasoning behind that?
Thank you, David, for that question. I'm happy to address that. I would have voted for them because these rules fall squarely within our mission to protect investors and also the other two parts of our mission, capital formation and fair and transparent markets. Over the past few years, we've seen a historic amount of capital invested in ESG-related investments. By one estimate, sustainable fund flows in the first half of 2020, for example, equal the total amount for the entirety of 2019. And alongside that investment has been a need for better quality ESG information that can give of use to investors in making informed investment decisions. As we all know, our bread and butter is ensuring that investors have high quality information to make informed investments. So that's our mission. Disclosures must be accurate, not misleading, provide a complete picture, informational picture of the condition of a particular company. And that's what these proposals do. There's a narrative out there that they do other things that they don't actually do. They don't change behavior of the investors, and they certainly don't set emission standards or shape environmental policy. Rather, they're designed to provide transparent disclosures to investors so they can make decisions about allocating their assets consistent with their investment objectives. And the other thing that's important to point out here is that these are proposals. They're designed to elicit thoughtful feedback from stakeholders so that when the rules are shaped here in the Commission, they can be as completely informed and as they're crafted in the process of them being crafted. So in the context of the corporate issuer proposal, that proposal incorporates the widely used TCFD framework. That's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as you may know. And the goal here is to provide disclosures on material climate-related governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. It would also require the disclosure of a company's greenhouse gas emissions using a protocol that
is also widely used and widely recognized, called the GHG protocol. There's a report by the Conference Board that showed that in 2021, more than half of S&P 500 companies disclosed climate risks in annual reports. 71% disclosed GHG emissions in their annual reports, their sustainability reports, or on their company websites. So these disclosures are already occurring, they're already happening. Of course, they're not disclosed in the same manner, and this rule is meant to make these disclosures more consistent, comparable, reliable, essentially to meet the goal of them being decision useful for investors. There's also proposed rules for advisors and funds that get at the core of investor protection. Are you able to substantiate the claims that you're making? As of 2021, asset managers and funds were responsible for $128 trillion and $55 trillion in investments respectively. That's a pretty significant footprint. And working families and the investing public, they play a part in they're a significant chunk of those numbers. This is very important to them. In response to investor demand, asset managers and funds have expanded their ESG products and services. And these rules were also aimed at providing more transparent disclosures about ESG practices. So I think the Commission, the great thing about the Commission's proposal is that when you see names like sustainable and green, they need to be supported with verifiable information. And when a retail investor, a working family who relies on these investments to make life-changing decisions about their finances, these disclosures are vital to them. And so I think having these easy to understand and comparable disclosures will facilitate these decisions. It's really, at the end of the day, truth in advertising, a concept that's so vital to our mission. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that addresses that question.
That's great, Commissioner. You've addressed a number of things in there. I'll just emphasize a couple of things. One, I think that is contrary to a lot of the media coverage in this space, is that the SEC is not setting greenhouse gas standards for corporations in the United States, for asset managers and the like. As you mentioned, many of these companies disclose this in many different ways already. And so lawyers are really struggling with trying to figure this out. I think another point that I think has been missed that's important, obviously the Commission is aware of this, that this is driven not necessarily by NGOs and consumers. It's actually been driven by the financial industry itself. And the media misses that very regularly. It's not a woke left-wing radical agenda. It is in fact the largest investment companies in the world were the originators of the push to get a level playing field, as they've described it. So thank you for those insights. One, an important one that we've talked about is that even if these new disclosure requirements do not become law, if they were not promulgated and they don't get finalized, Commissioner Allison Leigh had set up a task force that is focusing on greenwashing and related false claims. And I think, again, the general public is not aware of this, but the SEC is busy enforcing as we speak and looking at companies' disclosures. If you could expand on that for us and tell the audience what it is that the task force is set up to do and what they're doing. Some of these have been public, but I know that there are a number that are going on behind the scenes as well. So maybe you could flesh that out for us, Commissioner.
Sure. One of the things that I've learned in this role in my short time here is how essential the enforcement function is for investor protection, for deterring misbehavior, and ensuring that our markets are fair and transparent. So this task force that was established in 2021 was designed to develop enforcement initiatives that proactively identify ESG-related misconduct. So, but let me highlight one particular case that the SEC recently brought against BNY Mellon Investment Advisor. for misstatements and omissions regarding ESG considerations in making investment decisions for certain mutual funds that it managed. BNY Mellon represented in public statements that all investments in the fund had gone through an ESG quality review, even though that wasn't always the case. In fact, numerous investments held by certain of these funds didn't have an ESG quality review score as of the time of the investment. The fact is that BNY Mellon didn't always perform these reviews that it disclosed using as part of its investment selection process for certain mutual funds that it advised. So all of this goes to a basic requirement under the federal securities laws. Investment advisors need to be accurate about investment selection processes, and that applies to ESG-related selection processes.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we finished, Commissioner? I didn't mean to step on it. If you want.
Well, let me add one more point. I think that might didn't mean to stop at an awkward pause there, but this is part of a broader point that failing to follow through with what advisors tell investors they will do could constitute a violation. The other important thing to add here is that this is nothing new to the commission. There was another case from years ago, even before this task force was formed, called Pax World. Pax World was an advisor that purportedly offered socially responsible mutual funds, and it had disclosed that it complied with certain socially responsible investing restrictions. For example, it said it wouldn't invest in securities issued by companies deriving revenue from the manufacture of weapons, from alcohol, tobacco, or gambling. But despite these representations, it purchased securities contrary to those restrictions. So the takeaway from this case, again, is that like the BNY Mellon case, it just shows that advisors need to make sure that they're complying with what they tell investors that they will do.
Yeah, those are really great points. And for those in companies and practitioners here in the audience, this is not new. And in fact, being truthful and being able to substantiate and pressure test information is something that lawyers have been advising their clients since the securities laws were formed and the whole administration of regulatory disclosures happened. So it's anxiously awaiting the new rulemaking to actually start pressure testing information that goes into what you disclose to the public is probably ill-advised. This would be a good time to do that, regardless of what's coming on the horizons in more detail. Switching gears a bit, Commissioner, we've talked about climate. Obviously, this is on everybody's mind. It's an existential issue that we all live with and are concerned about. One of very high profile that the Commission has also talked about, and Chairman Gensler in particular, is human capital. Now, they're closely related. Obviously, the environmental impact on humans and people is clear, and disproportionate impact has been demonstrated. And we know there's rulemaking in process at the Commission relating to human capital disclosures, and I know you can't talk about the details of something that's sort of being cooked in the kitchen, so to speak. But maybe you could give us some sense of your views on what would be red flags for companies, concerns that they can have about how they're talking about human capital issues. So we're talking about racial equity, gender pay equity, environmental equity, environmental justice, these kinds of issues that are in the S category of ESG. As a leading person in the Commission that's going to enforce in this regard, could you give us some idea on what people should be focusing on here, in particular how they disclose to investors?
No, thank you, David, for this question. I see human capital disclosures as an important priority, and it's no secret that human capital is one of the most important assets for companies. You've seen the debate. Increasingly, our economy has moved beyond just producing goods and services, or beyond being an economy that just produces goods and services, and a greater share of a company's value is derived from the people that make up that company, instead of it's just a physical property, like it's machines, equipment, it's real estate. But our mission is rooted in the fundamental principle of providing the information that investors need to make important investment decisions in this space too, like I described earlier. And it applies to human capital as well. Without standardized decision useful information on human capital, investors are going to be denied a complete valuation picture of a company. So all that said, I think there's some key elements that I think would be important to include as a general principle or from a policy perspective. I think one of those is the company's overall strategy for maintaining its workforce, the types of skills and training investments it makes, and the employee benefits it provides to attract talent, the diversity and characteristics of its workforce, hiring, pay, promotion practices, retention and turnover metrics, and very importantly, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. I think there's also a lot of evidence out there that a strong workforce, that investment in a strong workforce can pay dividends in terms of innovation, growth, but also resiliency and stability. And it's a very tight labor market, as all of us know, and it has been for quite some time. So a diverse workforce allows for also to have a robust exchange of viewpoints and perspectives that really inform the quality of a company's products. And at the end of the day, let's face it, a happy worker is one that is more productive. So all these elements are important to the bottom line of a company. And there may be disagreements about the details on what constitutes a factor that affects the bottom line. But investors are demanding this information because they see it as material to their investment decisions. So as it is the case with other rulemakings, even including the ones we've discussed today, I think a mix of narrative and quantitative disclosures in this space can really be helpful in providing investors with the most useful mix of information about a company's human capital. And I just think it'll do wonders in facilitating objective measurement of these factors, and investors will be in a better position to compare companies and their performance in this area across a wide dimension of companies.
That's great. And I think, like the climate-related disclosures we were talking about, Commissioner, human capital is going to be one of these that's, I think, going to unearth a lot of comment. So you'll be busy dealing with the responses to that, no doubt. And when we're talking with our clients, and which is a cross-section of many different kinds of companies, as you underscored, talent is king and queen within these organizations. The ability to hire the best and the brightest, retaining people in this kind of environment, so once again, the movement for clarity in this isn't necessarily from the perimeter. It's actually from the core. Corporations are competing for that talent pool, and the disclosures related to that need to be pressure tested. You can't say you're a diverse, equitable, and inclusive employer if you're not. And so I think from a general level, that's very helpful insights. And more to follow. You should be looking at this one closely. I don't know if the commissioner is at liberty to say what he thinks the timing is for that rulemaking. If not, that's fine. But I know that people are eagerly awaiting and anticipating that.
For those of you who are not familiar with the way the commission works, that is a decision made by the chair. And I am not in a position to give you anything at this point in terms of an estimate either. It's really up to the chair. That's just the way the commission works. So hopefully sooner rather than later, for sure. I tend to agree with those who say that this is an important priority that should move rapidly. So, but we'll see. That really is up to the chair.
Thank you. And so we're going to switch gears yet again. The pandemic has brought a lot of challenges and changes to light, including small businesses, Commissioner, who've really, in some cases, really took it on the chin especially the early days of the pandemic. And there are a lot of things, the CARES Act and other things have been put in place. this is an interesting, I think for those that aren't as familiar with the SEC, your role in the economy is obviously essential. What are some of the tools available to the SEC, in particular related to small and family-owned businesses, that the SEC can help in terms of facilitating access to capital?
This is a very good question. And one of the things that really made an impression on me during the pandemic, when I was still in my previous position, is that it laid bare the difficulties that a lot of small businesses and underserved communities had in achieving equitable access to capital. In fact, that's a good thing in the sense that it was more visible. The question from here is, where do we go from here, right? So during that time, there were several efforts, the legislative efforts, where the federal government tried to provide small business assistance through a number of programs and did pretty robust assistance through the Paycheck Protection Program, Economic Injury Disaster Loans. These are SBA programs that are outside of the purview of this agency. But those programs ended, and despite that, or not necessarily despite of it, but the same issues remain in terms of access to capital in underserved communities. And I think that meaningfully addressing this is something that I think deserves more attention on the part of the commission, and I'm very focused on it. Some of the questions out there are that I think deserve more attention is, how can we better connect small businesses in these underserved communities with investors? In particular, making it easier for businesses who want to raise smaller amounts of money. And they may not have networks of friends or family they can turn to. So how do we do that? How do we make these connections? And I should say that these are more non-traditional tools available to the agency. They're not necessarily in the rulemaking process. They're certainly not part of the the enforcement function. But there are some tools that Congress has given us here that I think are worth exploring. How can we increase geographic diversity with smaller regional funds outside of the handful of metropolitan areas that currently often receive the lion's share of investment, of fund investments? How can we diversify that? And these are difficult questions. There are no easy answers to them, but I'm very interested in them, and I'll continue to explore possible ways of addressing this through the existing resources the agency has at its disposal, such as through the work of the SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation, and also its advisory committee. So I, for one, given my own experience dealing with small business issues in another context, look forward to exploring this further.
And I think that's a lesser known part of the SEC and the role with small businesses. So I would encourage folks to take a look at the Small Business Advisory Committee. Those meeting notes become public. I think I'm correct on that, Commissioner. And it's a real interesting conduit. One of the things we see with larger companies, in addition to investors and the small businesses, is the access of the larger companies to those smaller businesses. So they want to do business with minority-owned businesses. In fact, it's a mandate in some cases in their supply chain requirements, but they actually don't have access and they don't know who to go to. And so this is an area, I think, where larger companies can help smaller companies, and we've seen that play itself out. So, and I'm sure the Commissioner would be interested to hear from the larger companies on how to provide access to capital from the larger companies to those minority-owned businesses. I think we have time for one more question, and this one relates to, Commissioner, the SEC guidance on investment advisor fiduciary duties and the consideration of DE&I factors. We talked a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion in selecting or recommending advisors. And specifically, the staff found that consideration of DEI could be part of an advisor's reasonable belief that such recommendations are in the best interests of its client. And you, along with Commissioner Crenshaw, supported the guidance and urged the SEC to go even further on this point, and you're public on that. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that and what going further means?
Yes, I'm happy to, and I'm glad you raised this. I was thrilled to join Commissioner Crenshaw in that joint statement. But let me first say that I really want to commend the Asset Management Advisory Committee. And it's important to note that it was established by former SEC Chair Jay Clayton. And the thing that's most commendable here is that they made DEI a priority. As all of us are aware, this is not an easy topic to tackle. It can be challenging, controversial. I recently gave a speech before the ICI addressing all of these issues in more detail. But the bottom line is that I think it's important to be as constructive as possible in this space. And I think the AMAC recommendations really helped us frame the debate here, frame the discussion. I mean, they did a very thoughtful review of the current state of DEI in the asset management industry. And they offered some concrete and reasonable recommendations for the commission to consider. So overall, it elevated the conversation and amplified this is an important priority. I mean, there is a need to address the glaring lack of diversity in the asset management space. So you alluded to some of the staff guidance that was issued recently, and that Commissioner Crenshaw and I commented on. The upside is that it was done. The downside is that it's just guidance by staff. It's not commission level action. So as I see it, these recommendations were directed to the commission, and these recommendations could really make meaningful strides in addressing some of these DEI inequities. So my hope in raising these issues here and other fora is to raise their profile, and particularly these recommendations, because there's a lot more to do in this space to move the needle. And I remain committed to exploring the possibility of commission action on all 4 of these recommendations. And if we're unable to do that for whatever the reasons are, we have a responsibility to the public to explain why. And if you look at each of these recommendations, they each have their unique purpose. For example, take the recommendation to provide more transparency on an asset manager's diversity in its ownership ranks. To me, the only way you can address this is with a strong long-term commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to a continued constructive dialogue with all the stakeholders in good faith, and with commitment not to walk away from difficult challenges. This is a difficult challenge, but I think there's a lot of good faith out there, and it's worth leveraging that to meet these goals.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. We're just about out of time. I'm going to ask you the question that everybody has on their minds today. What's the coolest thing about being an SEC commissioner? Is there great swag? Do you get to drive around in a cool SEC limousine or something? What is it that I've never been an SEC commissioner? I've known some, but what would somebody here in San Francisco and those viewing in really think is a cool thing about doing the important work that you do? And I don't mean to make light of it, obviously. You've been incredibly generous with your time, but what is it about being an SEC commissioner that we just wouldn't know or wouldn't think about?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. And we are public servants at the end of the day, or that is part and parcel of the role. And I've been a public servant for almost 32 years now, and it's really a commitment to the public, to the investing public, to working families who need advocates in positions like mine to ensure that their interests are being looked after. So there's certainly nothing glamorous, as you mentioned in a lighthearted way here. And I started by saying that we're public servants because this is a position that comes with a lot of responsibility, and I take that very seriously, and I'm very committed to it. So it's very exciting to be able to do that to me, and this position offers that opportunity in a way that a lot of the other government positions here don't necessarily. There's a lot of very exciting things that other public servants do in their space, but in this context, and also given my own upbringing, my own experience, it's just such a privilege to be here to speak to you, to groups like the ones who are here, audiences like yourselves, given the important work that you do, just to hear a different perspective, or from my perspective, as shaped by my own experience. I am not from the markets. I've never spent time in the markets. I'm very experienced in legislating on market issues and on policy issues. But the perspective that I bring is as the son of immigrant farm workers from Mexico, a working family who themselves had a small business in their home when I was growing up that helped me get through school and through college. My sister and I were able to, we successfully graduated from college, got graduate degrees, and are doing quite well because of the efforts of my parents, who again are from a working class background and with very little education, but very entrepreneurial. And what's so exciting about their experience is that, in terms of how it informs my work here, is that I wish they had had the opportunity to take advantage of a lot of the tools that this agency makes available to investors and to this space. And so it's a great opportunity to be here to channel that, to think through that, because the impact is significant for, this has implications for millions of people, what we do here every day. And it's so important to our economy, to the functioning of our markets. I can't say that there's one thing other than those values, but I thought I'd share that as a way of explaining what is so unique and exciting about this position.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. Really heartfelt answer, and thank you for your service, and really appreciate you taking the time to share with the group today. Terrific insights, and best of luck and success in the important role that you're playing in our nation's capital. So thank you again, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for your question.
Thank
you.
you.
If I could just say one more thing.
Yeah.
If I could have been there with you in person, I would have. I've spent a lot of time in San Francisco in my previous capacity working for Speaker Pelosi, and I'm envious that you're there, and I'm not, but maybe next time.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.